Christianity as a system of religion is sorry stuff. As science advances, belief in Christianity is fading in Europe. Christianity spreads in this country not because it has any intrinsic worth, for science has shown it has none, but because its missionaries are backed up by the powers of the purse. Of our own great religion, a European scientist has said, Buddhism is perfectly compatible with science. Christianity is diametrically opposed to it. Scientific thought has made its way in spite of Christianity, and it is by means of scientific thought that Christianity is ultimately designed to perish. It is perishing in Europe, but money makes it thrive here, while our own scientific gospel, Buddhism, is daily being robbed of its votaries. Buddhists of Burma, reflect well on our dangers. Can you bear to see sacrilegious hands deface or destroy our holy inheritance? You may be forgiven for mistaking this incendiary fulmination uttered at the turn of the 20th century as coming from one of the many rapidly rising, righteous and educated Burmese nationalists who were coming to mobilise. No, rather, these are the words of U Dhammaloka, Myanmar's first ordained Buddhist monk of European descent. Oh yeah, and he was also an Irish hobo. Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's January 13, 2021 in Australia, and today we are speaking with Dr Alicia Turner, who is Associate Professor of Humanities and Religious Studies at York University in Canada. Hi Alicia.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It's great to have you here. Now, you've published a book just last year with the excellent title, The Irish Buddhist, the Forgotten Monk Who Faced Down the British Empire. This was co-authored with Laurence and Brian Bocking and is the culmination of many years of research into the enigmatic figure U Dhammaloka by the three of you, independently and working together. So this book and historical figure will be the centre of our conversation today. But before we get to talking about U Dhammaloka as a person, let's talk about his times. This Irish Buddhist lived through part of what was referred to as the Buddhist revival, which played a major role in the anti-colonial movements that hastened the end of Western Empire in Asia. And this is something, Alicia, that you've published a whole other book on before. So what was this Buddhist revival in colonial Southeast Asia? You know, what was Asia's politics and rule like back then?
Thanks, Luke, for having me on and letting me do this podcast. It's really fun to be able to talk to people here, there, and everywhere, and especially people interested in Myanmar and Myanmar history, and particularly coming out of ANU. You guys have such a great program. To think a little bit about what the context is for who U Dhammaloka was and what he did in Burma is, in part, it is colonial Burma that we're talking about. We were not sure, but we think he was born about 1850. He had a life. He was born in Ireland, outside of Dublin, to a working class plebeian family. He lived a life of a hobo, of a sailor, and eventually he washes up in Burma. But the background we need to think about what Burma looked like at this time period. So the mid-19th century and late 19th century, of course, the British had conquered Burma in three different sections, 1824, 1852, and 1885. And at one point, Dhammaloka claims he was there just after the fall of the monarchy in 1885. But looking at the context also, Burma at this point is part of colonial India. So it's ruled by the British. And it's ruled under a system of direct rule at this point. It's not the East India Company anymore. And it has sets of policies of religious non-interference and religious independence, including policies like saying that you should have Buddhist law for Buddhists and Hindu law for Hindu and Muslim law for Muslims. But part of Burmese reactions to colonialism that have been leading up to this are about the 1890s. Burmese Buddhists start to talk to each other and start to organize Buddhism in a slightly different way. Because you don't have the king anymore who'd been giving huge donations to support the monks are not in as strong a footing as they've been in the past. And lay people step in to fill the void, both with donations, but also creating associations. And they understand themselves to be supporting Buddhism, and in fact to be saving Buddhism. There's a concern that Buddhism is on the decline. While this is going on in Burma and lay people are organizing these kind of things, similar kinds of movements are happening across Asia. So we have an important movement in Sri Lanka in which Sri Lankan monks really oppose Christian missionaries there. They actually have debates with Christian missionaries. And we get the American Colonel Olcott, who comes as a theosophist to Sri Lanka and gets together and works with Anagarika Dhammapala for an international Buddhist movement, eventually trying to save Bodh Gaya, the site of Bodh Gaya in India. We have people in Japan creating Buddhist associations and Buddhist organizing. It's kind of in the air across Asia in the time period we're talking about, which is the last decade of the 19th century and the first couple decades of the 20th century. So there's a sort of broader movement that Buddhism is a rallying cry to bring people together, that something has been lost because of colonialism in terms of Buddhism, that Buddhism is on the decline, and that lay people can be engaged and do something to improve it. And this is the milieu that Dhammaloka comes into, and he really sort of steps up and engages that, both the international Buddhist networks that are going on, but very much the sort of ethos inside Burma, a concern that something vital is being lost in terms of Buddhism at the moment that he arrives there.
Right, and when U Dhammaloka leaves the scene in Myanmar is kind of around the same time that Buddhist Burmese nationalism really, really sort of takes off, as I understand it. And you write that he pioneered approaches and issues that became really important ones later on in Burmese nationalism leading up to independence and, of course, World War II. So what were a couple of these approaches and issues that he pioneered?
Dhammaloka is terribly fun. He is bombastic and engaged politically. He's charismatic. At one point, somebody says of him, he could charm the heart out of an old wheelbarrow. And he's done that for my co-authors and I think it's been really fun to sort of pick apart the parts of his life, figure out what we can from what's lost and what exists in the archive. But I don't want to give him too much credit. He wasn't actually the first European ordained as a Buddhist monk. He and a couple of others vie for the claim of being the first European ordained, but really we know that actually there had been some Europeans ordained as Theravada monks even a few decades earlier. One in Thailand for sure. There probably, I don't think we have records of any in Myanmar, but given the kind of migrant, transient people we're talking about, there's a chance that someone had been ordained before Dhammaloka. He's definitely sort of among the first, and the two that come immediately after him that get a fair bit of press. He certainly pioneered before they did. But I think in the same way, a lot of the tactics that get engaged in the nationalist movement that we can see Dhammaloka trying out, I don't want to give him all the credit. These are tactics and organizing things that are very much in the air internationally, like creating lay associations. But there are ways in which that he engages these. So one of the first actions he does is to put up posters saying that Christian missionaries should not be distributing their tracts at the Shwedagon Pagoda. And he says Christian missionaries are no longer welcome here by the authority of U Dhammaloka, of the Tavoy Monastery, Due Jaun. And then at the Pagoda Festival for the Shwedagon, he confronts an off-duty police officer who's wearing his shoes on the pagoda. Anybody who knows Myanmar well knows the idea of wearing your shoes on top of a pagoda at all is a great insult. And it was one that was very much carried out by the British, that certain groups of people were allowed to do, although technically an off-duty police officer who was Indian should not have been doing it. But he makes a pretty big stink about it. And he actually gets accused, not officially, but in the papers, gets accused of sedition. He gets accused of saying, we've taken their country from them and now we're trotting all over their religion. Meaning the British have come and taken Burma and now they're walking all over Burmese Buddhism. And this makes him incredibly famous. Of course, he wasn't the first person to bring up the question of shoes in Burma. Opo Sayadaw had very controversially pushed this issue for a particular question of intention and performance and ritual that was related but different. But of course, the later shoe issue of 1918, 1919 is going to be the major rallying cry for the YMBA, and one of the points in which we really get a jumping off of the nationalist movement in Burma. Similarly, Dhammaloka, in most of the missions and places he works, he likes to start schools, and particularly English language schools that are Buddhist schools, that he means to teach both Buddhism and to teach a secular education of English language, mathematics, these sorts of things, because he really values the kind of organizing and bringing together that a school can do, and as a way to promote Buddhism. So he has a mission in Bangkok, one in Penang, and other places where he forms these schools. And the schools tend to be multi-ethnic. They have Chinese and Indian students, and they also tend to have a very specific Buddhist focus, and that using a school as a way to promote Buddhism. And this is something, again, you see in the nationalist movement. If you look at the 1920 Rangoon University strike, which it was evocative for so many people, that really is followed by the independent school movement, the nationalist school movement, in which young Burmese intellectuals say, we don't need to go to the British schools anymore. We don't need to go to the missionary schools. We can have our own schools. And that idea of education is central to the movement. It's definitely something that Dhammaloka has and builds on in the decade before the nationalist movement comes to the fore.
That's really interesting because, you've talked about how maybe pioneering is a bit too strong of a term. But you've also made connections there between what he was doing and the nationalist movement that came later. But you've also, I think, signaled some departures, which is U Dhammaloka's kind of focus on multi-ethnic Buddhism. Am I to understand that is kind of a significant departure from the kind of Buddhist nationalism that led to the colonial movement, or that might continue today?
It's always dangerous when you're looking at history to read backwards and assume what's there later is there earlier. And so the nationalist movement that we can see in the 1930s, and in particular, the Burmese nationalism that's written the history books from the 40s and 50s straight through to the contemporary history books, is really shaped out of the kind of nationalism out of the 1930s. And it has come out and has a legacy of a conflict with Indians, and who is going to be considered a real Burmese person inside Burma. But we have to remember that isn't necessarily the case. Burma, most of lower Burma at the turn of the 20th century was pretty cosmopolitan. And actually people interacted a lot. So people who were Indian of Hindu descent, Indian of Muslim descent, Chinese descent, but as well as, people from all over. We have Armenians, we have Jews. These are fairly cosmopolitan places. And Dhammaloka himself has really pretty broad multi-ethnic credentials. So when he gets ordained, he's ordained to live at the Tavoy Monastery, which he calls the big school in Chinatown. The Tavoy Monastery is in a monastic complex called Theat Daw, and Theat Daw is a set of monasteries that were scooped up by the British in the 1850s that had been all over what is now Rangoon and moved into this one little plot of land. Basically, all the Burmese monasteries in what would become the city were scooped up and shoved together in this place, and the Tavoy Monastery was one of them. And it's on Lama Daw. All of you know Burma, you know that Lama Daw is Chinatown. It's directly up Lama Daw from what at that point was called Godwin Street and the Godwin Ports. But on the river there, where Lama Daw goes down into the river, that it was at the time the most active local shipping port. So people from everywhere came. Anybody in southern Burma who'd got on a boat would come there. If you were coming to the capital for education, for trade, to meet family, anything else, you got off there and you walked up into Chinatown. And that meant if you come from India, if you'd come from Singapore or Penang, this was the place that you mixed. And more importantly, when you get off the boat, when you arrive, not as a rich European, but as your everyday working Burmese, say from Tavoy, you need a place to stay. You need connections and networks to how to figure out how to sell the goods you've brought with you or how to get a job. And generally, historically, what has happened is that people go to a monastery associated with the place they came from. So the Tavoy Monastery at Theat Daw was known as a place that took in people from Tavoy. I actually once interviewed a Due monk in Yangon, and I had trouble finding his monastery. And I said, why are there so many different Due monasteries in Yangon? And he looked at me kind of silly, and he said, well, to house people from Due. And I looked over, and it was pretty clear. There were two laymen who had their stuff in the corner, had been sleeping there the night before. Monasteries become a place for people to come and stay. But Due, being a shipping port to the south, being a place of sailors, but also being a place where lots of cultures have interacted, Mon, Karen, Burmese, Thai, Malay, Chinese, and Indian later, all of those, the Tavoy Monastery became a place that basically took in anybody, and particularly any sailors and travelers. That's how Dhammaloka got taken in. It didn't matter that he was European. He was one of them. And Lama Daw, and in particular, and the Theat Daw Jaundai became a really multi-religious, multi-ethnic place. It became a place where people interacted. And it didn't matter necessarily what your religious background was. So we have tales of Pui festivals happening inside this monastery, and we have snooty upper class Burmese Buddhists who come in and go, oh, this is no good. The place is filled with Indians and Chinese. Right. And I like to make fun of that snooty Burmese Buddhist, but I also like to think, that means it was very normal for the people there to interact with their neighbors who might be Muslim, who might be Hindu, who might practice Chinese religions, and that ethnicity really didn't matter, and religion as an identity really didn't matter to a lot of the people there. And so I think in that way, Dhammaloka's vision, it wasn't a vision of an ethnicity, and it wasn't a vision of a nation. It was a vision of Buddhism, and Buddhism for him was a place where everybody could come in. The monastery schools he runs in Penang or Bangkok often have poor children whose family background is not Buddhist, but who come to the Buddhist schools because it's clearly a place where people are welcomed.
Yeah, that's just fascinating. What an incredible place to be able to visit. So you've mentioned how U Dhammaloka was taken in by the Tavoy Monastery, and then at some point he was ordained, and he went on to draw crowds of thousands as he travelled around on preaching tours, also attracting the ire of Christian missionaries and British colonial officials. But maybe we can backtrack and think about before he found fame and how did he get to British Burma?
The short answer is we don't know, and we may never know for sure. And it's definitely been a really fun detective story to figure out what we can figure out. And a lot of what we know is the sort of social history, in part because poor and working class folks don't have their histories written well and documented well, right? There are times in which they interact with the state, and the state takes notice and they get written down, like sometimes on a passenger list or sometimes on a list of seamen employed on a ship. But often enough, people slip through the cracks. And this is also a time period in which the idea of being identifiable was only coming to the fore. So the idea of mugshots and fingerprints are new technologies, and passports are new technologies that are not universal yet. So the best we can tell from the stories Dhammaloka has told about himself was that in Asia, he was really a beachcomber. And in contemporary Southeast Asia, we're all pretty aware of the figure of the backpacker, right? A European or a North American or Australian who comes to Southeast Asia and lives on the cheap and exists kind of on the margins of society. The beachcombers were a predecessor to that group of people, but with a different sort of twist. To think about what colonial Asia looked like, we think in terms of the colonized, right? The Burmese who are colonized, Indians in India being colonized, and the British. And our image of the British is upper middle class bureaucrat or an upper class administrator, usually male. But actually, empires don't work that way. Empires work because people do the work of them. So the British Empire relied on a massive army of European military folks who existed in all of its of British India and other colonies. They relied on massive networks of sailors, and sailors of all ethnicities, including America, or sailors coming from the US, sailors of African descent, Southeast Asian sailors, and they relied on like other working class folks to do the work of connecting their network together. So the bits we've been able to pick together, probably Dhammaloka was born around 1850. The figure we think we can find in the records, he had claimed he was born in Booterstown, Blackrock, which is just outside of Dublin, and just down from the docks. Probably jumped ship to Liverpool at a fairly young age, which is not uncommon for young Irishmen of this time period. This is after the famine. There isn't a lot of prospect of advancement inside Ireland at this point. And so there's massive emigration out of Ireland. Like lots of people, he probably snuck on a ship or worked on a ship from Liverpool to the US. And then from New York, the story he tells is he was a hobo. He was an itinerant migrant worker, took an odd job here and there, rode the rails in the sense that he would jump trains from place to place, find a little bit of work here, there, and find ways to make a living. In the era after the Civil War in the United States, there was masses of what was called a hobo army, masses of young men who were unemployed, migrant, moving around, looking for a place to be. What's fascinating about that world that we found out is that actually this group of people had a really interesting set of politics. There was hobo libraries and hobo universities where people talked about political issues, where they maintained sets of books and traded them around. And it seems pretty clear from what we know of Dhammaloka's later politics that he was probably engaged with people in these places. That he probably started reading and thinking and questioning the nature of the world there. He eventually ends up working on a boat on a river in California, then in San Francisco, working on the docks, and then again starts working on a ship on the shipping line between San Francisco and Yokohama in Japan, and then around Asia. And we know eventually he jumps ship in Yangon. He becomes a tally clerk, which is actually it's an upper level working class position. It's a position of responsibility. but at some point wanders into the Tavoy monastery and decides that that's the life for him. So he has both this working class credentials, this life in which he's seen lots of different kinds of people on multiple continents, and this political background in which he's asked some pretty critical questions about the ways in which the world's organized and what's fair, and has some pretty distinct ideas about colonialism for sure, and missionary Christianity as well.
It makes a lot of sense that he's steeped in, Christianity and the British Empire before he was ordained. But I wonder if you have any evidence of him being exposed to Buddhism before Myanmar, or maybe contextual information about the way that Buddhism was talked and thought about within his worlds before he arrived to Myanmar. Because ultimately, I really wonder, I don't know if we can ever know this, but what do you think sparked his ordination or his worldly renunciation, personal transformation?
It's a good question. We've done a lot of work, and Brian and Laurence, my two co-authors, much more than I, but we've scoured looking for other European men who chose to ordain as Buddhists around this time period, or people who've converted to Buddhism one way or another. We have one source that I think is particularly fascinating, of someone who himself was a sailor, a working class man, and spent his life as a sailor. And he describes how, having been in Asian ports and reading some texts and being told about Buddhist ideas, really made him feel at home. And that was the moment to convert to Buddhism. And even after he'd gone back to England, he still thought of parts of Asia as home, because it really appealed to him. The other sort of standard narrative is a text called Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia. It was incredibly popular. And many people would read it. It was published in multiple languages and multiple editions. So it was often the first introduction to Buddhism, particularly as a popular piece in Europe or North America. And lots of other figures of this type describe reading The Light of Asia. We don't necessarily have Dhammaloka going that route. That's a pretty literary, intellectual route to go. And Dhammaloka is, if anything, more focused on ritual, pragmatism, and politics than he is on texts and philosophy. I think, as he describes, this was the place that he felt most at peace, and it's where he felt allied. I think in the Tavoy monastery, he saw a purpose for good in the world that he wanted to be a part of. We tend to have assumptions in the 21st century, late 20th century, of what true Buddhism is, or what's a good monk, that comes out of really textual-based. Buddhism is a philosophy. Buddhism is something you could learn in texts. And there are certainly Europeans of Dhammaloka's time period who believe that, who think the true Buddhism is in Pali texts, and there are certainly elite Buddhists, Burmese Buddhists, who think that. But that's never been true for the vast majority of people. For the vast majority of people, Buddhism is something you do, something you're engaged in. It's a set of practices, it's a way of being. And that is clear for Dhammaloka, that he's less interested in that sort of idealized philosophy and much more interested in the pragmatics of it. But to that end, he was a monk, and a good monk, by the arbiter, the only arbiter you can offer, which is lay people making donations. When he would go to a town, and he would get called to towns all the way up and down Burma, from the south to the north, he would come to town to preach, and lay people would flock to him. And unlike other celebrity preachers, he would get up in the morning and do alms rounds barefoot every day. He ate the meals that were served to him. To look at him, we're told, he performed being a monk. He looked like a monk. He acted like a monk. He was able to hold himself the right way, to do the right things with his body. And he was understood in that way to be a true and correct Burmese monk, in a way that the other Europeans necessarily didn't always fit in. So later Europeans who ordained as monks they're seen as kind of outside, whereas Dhammaloka is seen as completely fitting in that way.
Yeah, that's really cool. And what else did he sort of do? He traveled around, he preached, he was and acted like a monk. He debated and apparently devastated Christians in front of live audiences. So could you talk a bit about U Dhammaloka's time in Myanmar? Because he did end up leaving sooner than we might expect.
He first is ordained in 1900, and he travels Burma in 1901 and 1902, doing these sort of really, really popular preaching tours after the Shu controversy. He will come in and say, I'm not going to preach to you about the Dhamma because there are learned monks here who know much better than I. What I want to preach to you about is the ways in which British colonialism is a threat to Buddhism, that Buddhism is under threat. And that's what he would preach. And he would say specifically, it is the British who come at us with political power. It's the Christian missionaries who are looking to convert you away from your life. And it's alcohol that the British have brought. And those three things are making Burma lose its Buddhism. And you need to rally with me against those and sort of step together and bring Buddhism back. And he has massive appeal with this. People really like the message. He's also, the one time he doesn't really act like a monk, or he doesn't really act very Burmese, is that he is bombastic and charismatic. He's rocking on his feet. He speaks with his arms. So while collecting alms, he is the picture of peacefulness and that sort of quiet monastic mindset, but you put him behind the podium to start preaching and he's wonderfully entertaining and engaging and looks perhaps a bit, but definitely not Burmese, and perhaps maybe understood a bit more Irish in that way. He leaves Burma in 1902 to go to Japan for an International Buddhist Association meeting, or what he understands to be that. He comes back to Burma, then later goes to Singapore, where he meets up with the Shan Saobua, and they go to Bangkok together, where the Saobua of Kengtung actually negotiates a political conflict that's been happening at the edge of Shan states with the Thai government. And then Dhammaloka tries to set himself up kind of as the patron of Burmese Buddhists in Bangkok. And he sets up an English teaching school there at a monastery, and that school still exists in Bangkok. Still teaches English. It's actually quite a big school. The part of town it was in was the Dawei part of town. It was a part of Bangkok where all of the people from Dawei live. He went to Penang and set up a school there at the Burmese monastery that's in Penang, a famous and really wonderful place. And he engages in these times in debates with Christian missionaries in each of these places, pushing education and pushing temperance. Where he leaves before we would think he would, he does a tour in 1909 of Sri Lanka. And during this tour in Sri Lanka, he's starting to really upset the colonial officials there, and in particular upsetting the Christian missionaries. And then in 1911, he goes to Mulamyang and comes back to Burma for a while, and he preaches in Mulamyang. And he says that the Christian missionaries are the biggest blackguards that you've ever heard of, that they're engaged in immorality, that they're using money to convert, the kind of the language you opened this podcast with. Except that there's somebody there, one of the missionaries actually writes it down. And Dhammaloka gets prosecuted for sedition. For the statute is actually that he has inciting enmity between between classes of Her Majesty's subjects. There's rules about defaming other religions that they could have prosecuted him, and they didn't. They decided to basically call this sedition and to call it creating factions within colonialism, which in many ways is exactly what he meant to do. He's held over with a bond, 2,000 rupees, and then he gets a lawyer to defend him. The lawyer is probably very well known. He becomes one of the most famous nationalist lawyers later on, and head of the GCBA at one point. And the trial gets moved to Rangoon for the appeal. What happens in Rangoon is amazing. Outside of the monastery at Lamada, a brand new movie theater starts up, and they take all the profits from the movie theater to raise money for Dhammaloka's defense fund. And on the day his appeal is organized, all of the bazaars from Chinatown through the Sorti Bazaar, the bazaar right on that's right on the Strand, all the way from Lamada down to where Mahabandula Park is, people march and process. All business stops in town, and they mass at what's this new courthouse where his appeal is supposed to be had. And the British freak out, as you can imagine, and decide that they're going to adjourn the trial for that day because they think they're going to have a riot on their hands. And they hold the trial in a few days later, and it's upheld. He is convicted of having said these things. And his sentence is really that he has to be good for 1 year, that there is this bond held over his head to be good for 1 year. After 1 year, we're not clear whether there were more threats or what to him, but he has this massive popularity. Actually, being taken to court has been great for his popularity in Burma. But he decides to leave Burma at that point, and he goes to Australia. And he goes perhaps to connect with some other Buddhist converts and sympathizers that he may have known earlier in Australia. But the story from there gets interesting.
That sort of touches on this tension between his Buddhism and his politics. And I remember the way that he would sign himself was with a whole series of initials and acronyms after his Buddhist name, his monk name, U Dhammaloka, including being a member of like a temperance society and stuff. So how did all of this fit in? He renounced the world, but he was still extremely located in, for a British bureaucrat's view of the world, you know, these kind of discrete political units. Is there anything in that? He was a high-profile Buddhist for, say, 10 years, but in the wider story of his life, was that the sort of was Buddhism the sort of exceptional part of it? Was he more of an agitator?
I think what Dhammaloka does well for us is to shake us up a little bit about why we think there's boundaries between things like that, right? Dhammaloka is a monk. Dhammaloka is an organizer, right? He is a working class or hobo, or he works on a ship. But actually, those are in no way exclusive categories. And if we look at the history of monks in Burma, we know pretty well that monks take on very different roles in different places and different times, right? We have incredibly charismatic monks. We have monks who are very much engaged in social welfare projects. We have monks who are engaged in political projects as well. And we have monks who are a small village monk who doesn't really have a scope beyond that. We have monks who are incredibly scholastic and are, like us crazy academics, happiest when they're with their books. What Dhammaloka understood as the most important thing was to preserve and promote Buddhism. And the way he thought Buddhism needed to be preserved was to make sure that the threats from British colonialism, the threats of impoverishment of Buddhists, the threats of Buddhists not having a good education, the threats of Buddhists not being moral, the threats of what he understood as drinking alcohol to be morally a problem, that to support Buddhism, he needed to oppose those things and rally people to do it. And that's what he understood his purpose of being a monk is.
And so U Dhammaloka, as you said, ended up leaving Burma and going to Australia. What became of him? What do we know of what became of him? And did he leave a legacy inside Burma? Were people waiting for his return? Did people wonder where he went? And looking at the broader legacy for you or I, and for you as the author of this book, how was he a challenge to some of the core power relationships of this period of high imperialism? We've kind of danced around all these categories and what the British Empire tried to do to, or was doing to society, but maybe we can address it a bit more explicitly. So that's a two-part question, sorry.
That's okay. The story of Australia is wonderful. He arrives, he checks in, we think, to a temperance hotel, and then mysteriously letters to the newspapers start arriving about the death of Dhammaloka, and that this man who wouldn't wear any shoes and dressed in these thin robes had died here, and what should we do with his books? And the news of his death went across India and Southeast Asia quite broadly, because people were very interested. They'd been following him in the newspapers quite a bit, and certainly in Burma, people were interested. And so the news of his death went everywhere. And then a few months later, he turns up perfectly alive again in Bangkok. Right? So the news of his death was much exaggerated, and we're not exactly sure. He probably faked his own death. It's likely he wrote those letters himself. We don't know exactly why. It could be that there was another trial for sedition or some other sort of legal proceedings that were following him, and he was trying to get out of that. He doesn't go back to Burma. He probably is in Singapore a bit, but other than that, he really isn't in British territory, as far as we know. He is in the Malay states, and he's in Penang briefly. He's in Bangkok. He claims to go to Cambodia, but we don't have any records of him doing that. And then, sadly, he just fades off the map. This is World War I, and lots of upheaval is happening, but we don't have any real record of his death from there. Mm-hmm. I think so it's an interesting story, and Brian and Laurence and I would be delighted for somebody to come up and say, no, I can prove, here's where he was. He's in Laos for the next 30 years or some such. And maybe someone will. The kind of work it takes to dig out of the archives and find the little bits and pieces of stories like this is difficult, and new things come up every day. I think what Dhammaloka does, he has a legacy. Well, in many ways, he doesn't have a legacy. We call it the forgotten monk, because whereas Ananda Maitreya, very much another European ordained as a monk around the same time period, but he has a very intellectual legacy. He's continued in the legacy in that he helps form the Buddhist Society of Great Britain and Ireland, which is a very middle class kind of thing. He's remembered, but Dhammaloka wasn't. There wasn't really anything official memory of Dhammaloka for much of anything in Burma. He was very much lost to history for a long time. But I think he has an important legacy for us in a number of ways. I think one of the challenges he really puts out there is the kind of networks and the promiscuous engagement across religious boundaries, ethnic boundaries that brought people together. So whereas, we think of colonized as this great split in terms of British colonialism, Dhammaloka points out that there are working class and poor Europeans all across Asia who have lives, and most of them live the rest of their lives in Asia in one way or another, whether they're beachcombers and itinerants or sailors or in the military. He also points out that whereas we tell the history of the big Buddhist associations normally by scholars and middle-class people, actually it was very much run by working class and much more plebeian Buddhists who connected across the globe. And that we need to keep our eye on issues of class, in particular when we think about both colonialism and thinking about nationalism and Buddhist movements' reactions to that. And we need to be pretty open to, whereas later nationalism has us really focused either on nationals, those are citizens who belong to the nation, or to a particular ethnic group that's privileged by the nation. That world that became the nation state of the mid-20th century wasn't inherent. It didn't have to be that way. There were very different ways of thinking about who belonged. at the turn of the 20th century, Dhammaloka clearly belonged, and the people of the Tavoy monastery thought he belonged to them. And they thought that and sailor of African descent who showed up belonged to them. And that Indians and Chinese who showed up to the Pui belonged to them. And that sense of belonging and interconnection across the what we assume to be strict boundaries of Buddhism and Islam and Hinduism, or Indians, Burmese, Chinese, Karens, Europeans, Shans, as distinct, probably was much more fluid in his time period. And I think one of the great things he's given to us is a lens to see that and to keep our eye on that, to warn ourselves that we need to remember that both class and ethnic interaction are important and going on much more than the stories we tell usually admit.
Yeah, definitely. And for whoever reads this book, he will not be forgotten. What about his tangible physical legacy? What of the Tavoy monastery? Are there any plaques, or is there anything we can see of U Dhammaloka in Yangon 2021?
No, not yet. The Tavoy monastery still exists, but Theatda Jaundai was a place of rebels then and through the whole of the 20th century, which meant it was involved in a handful of different political movements, both those we might support and those we might not. So there was moments in which it was very much a place that Indians and Muslims and Chinese were all welcome, and then there were moments in which it was involved in anti-Muslim or anti-Indian riots. In 88, it was a place that was very political. In fact, a trial of some captured military folks by democracy activists happened inside this monastery. But given that it's been a political place, thus it's also been a place that's been purged many times. So when the authorities take back over, they decide that the monks running these various monasteries are bad monks and they get swept out and new monks get put in their place, which means that the history and records are really gone, that they have changed hands enough times that there's just not much left there. I've spoken with a few years ago with the abbot of the Tavoy monastery, and when travel is possible again, I'm very much looking forward to bringing a copy of the book back into that monastery so that there's a copy of the book there. In many ways, colonial Rangoon still exists on the streets of Yangon, and you can see Dhammaloka's world. Lamadaw is still Lamadaw in many ways, but there's nothing specifically to him that's left there, unfortunately.
All right, and last question before recommendation. If you met U Dhammaloka today, let's say if you met him in his rebirth form or in a dream, and you could ask him one question that he would answer truthfully, what would you ask him?
Oh, that's a great question. First of all, I'd thank him because he has turned me on to all sorts of aspects of Burma that I wouldn't have seen, all sorts of connections, all sorts of joyful and interesting things. And I would certainly thank him for convincing me to go to Due. I think I'd probably ask him a bit more about Due when he was around, because I think he spent time there, but we don't have a lot of evidence. But if I had a really specific question, at one point in his story, he pulls out of the inside of his robe a notebook full of newspaper clippings about himself. And I want to see that set of newspaper clippings because I've spent a decade trying to pin down with my co-authors, Brian and Laurence, everything that's ever been written about him. But I'm sure there are something in there that we've missed. So I would love to see those.
Oh, yeah, that sounds very juicy.
It also sounds like a geeky historian. That's who we are.
You need to follow someone for 10 years and to put together such a book like this. So congratulations to you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And then the final question on every episode of Myanmar Musings is for our guest, U Alicia, to give a recommendation to our audience that can be anything. Would you like to give a recommendation today?
I have sat in awe of Myanmar studies over the past 5 years of how much fascinating new work is coming out. And a nice thing about being the spot in my career I am is I often get asked to review articles as they come through before they get published. So I see a lot of cool things before they come out. And I don't think I can pick just one. To be very honest, I think this is a moment of flowering in Burma studies where people are asking great questions. People are engaging with theory. So yeah, there's a lot of things I'm really excited to see in the next few years. Just to say that, yeah, I will be buying books and downloading articles like crazy, and that I really enjoy this field. I think we're one of the best groups out there, because we take care of each other, we write smart things, and I think we're well networked and well organized. Certainly, Tuesday nights at Ponsadon have helped that over the years.
Indeed. Well, that's a great overall recommendation I'm sure most listeners can get on board with. Thank you so much for joining us today and having this conversation, and really congratulations again on this excellent book. It's been a wild ride, and I hope that this book inspires others, and maybe more information can come out, not just about the wider, but about U Dhammaloka's life. Like you said, this kind of multi-sited, multi-archival, piecing together kind of history, it requires so much time, and maybe now his name will become less forgotten.
If there's anyone out there whose auntie has a box in their hidden in their house with bits and pieces about U Dhammaloka, or any other interesting Europeans or others who are ordained as monks in this time period, I would love to hear about it. This is always collaborative work, and so anything that you might find, I would love to hear it. And I'm sure there are more figures who will come out of the woodwork out of all of this.
Well, thank you so much for coming on Myanmar Musings.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Thank you so much.